Jessica has been my student for more than 2 years. She's a wonderful student and has done a wonderful comparative research about two social movements, one in Iran, one in the United States. Black Lives Matter here in the US and Women, Life, Freedom in Iran. She has been doing this research trying to find the connection between three different variables: the behavior of political agents, the space, and regime type. It has been an honor to work with her and an honor to invite her to present her research.
Hi again. Okay. Hello, my name is Jessie Queck. I am in my last semester at Eastern studying political science and sociology. In this presentation, I will be comparing protest tactics and state response in two recent major protest movements: the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States in 2020 and the Women, Life, Freedom protests in the Islamic Republic of Iran in 2022. First, let's compare some important characteristics in the context of the two. In each case, protests were sparked by civilian murders by state actors, one by the Minneapolis Police Department and one by Guidance Patrol or Morality Police. However, protests in the United States were largely aimed at structural reform of the policing system, while protests in Iran took on the target of state leaders and the role that their ideologies play in suppressing women. It's also important to note that the Black Lives Matter protests took place within a democratic federalist state, while the Women, Life, Freedom protests took place within an authoritarian state. And that's the regime type is one thing that we're going to be comparing today. So let's look more closely at the tactics and the state response of Black Lives Matter protests. This wave of Black Lives Matter demonstrations made up possibly the largest protest movement in US history, and they also had the most diverse group of participants of any protest movement in the United States. They were purposely incredibly decentralized, so they weren't following a particular leader or a central ideology, and because of this, they were diverse in their demonstration and their advocacy approaches. To begin, though, many of the protests aimed for no business as usual, meaning that they aimed to force those who were not already involved in or affected by the movement to pay attention to the protests. They also used tactics of appearance, tactics that were intended to draw interest to the symbolic representations of the issue. Some of these tactics included Black people staring back into the eyes of police officers, hosting mass die-ins in highly visible areas, and using repeatable, recognizable chants during demonstrations that came from victims of police brutality, phrases like "hands up, don't shoot," and "I can't breathe." The state response was varied, and this was an important factor in how the protests evolved. Largely, the federal and state responses were more negative. Many protesters were charged with greater crimes than they were originally arrested for, including federal level charges. 93 states or localities also attempted to prevent further protests with laws that prohibited or restricted them. More than half of the protests that police officers or other authorities were involved in also saw documented cases of violence or force, including instigating violence with peaceful protesters, using tear gas, pepper spray, or kinetic impact projectiles like rubber bullets to disperse crowds. However, some states and localities were clear in their support of the protests and their goals. Some took on symbolic gestures like renaming or painting streets in honor of the movement or in honor of victims of police brutality, and in some cases, high-level politicians or celebrities also joined the demonstrations. This varied response allowed the protests to continue and to take on new tactics. Increasingly, the movement rejected appropriate decorum that had become the focus of media coverage. Tactics also moved to more direct and sustained control of space. This included setting up basketball courts or stages for dance in front of monuments like the Robert E. Lee statue in some areas, and directly subverting police surveillance systems to allow for greater freedom of movement among the protesters. Protesters also took on a more personal approach, marching down neighborhood streets or carrying mirror caskets, which forced riot police responding to protests to see themselves as the Black community saw them. As a whole, though, these direct tactics were intended to raise the cost of ignoring protests as they continued. Now let's take a look at the evolution of the women life freedom protests and their tactics. This wave of protests was also one of the largest, most diverse, and most sustained movements in recent Iranian history. They were largely led by women, and their goals were aimed more directly at the authoritarian regime itself and its leaders. At the start of the movement, protest tactics were intentionally very disruptive. Protesters blocked streets for long periods of time and used these highly visible locations to perform acts that spread their message. This included burning headscarves and tossing turbans, both acts that signaled the widespread disrespect for the regime and the prevailing religious ideology. Protesters also danced in the streets, which was also an action that resisted the norms set by the dominant ideology. Unlike in the United States, the state response was consistent and it was thorough. The response was also much more directly violent and prosecution was more widespread. Authorities used psychological warfare, including spreading rumors and conspiracies about protesters, and charging protesters with false crimes to discourage active or new participants from taking part. Authorities carried out mass arrests and sought the highest charges for those arrested, and they also used indiscriminate violence against protesters and used more lethal tactics, including shooting protesters in the face and in the genitals, threatening to behead protesters, and carrying out executions for those who participated in the demonstrations. This response led protesters to drastically change their approach. Protests became more decentralized, moving away from public squares and into side streets, onto rooftops, and even chanting out of windows of apartment complexes. These demonstrations were often smaller and took place in areas where protesters could easily get away from authorities, or where it would be harder for authorities to identify and prosecute them. Acts of resistance also moved online, where protesters used social media and messaging platforms to spread messages about areas to avoid or target for demonstrations. Protesters also took to disarming state security systems to allow them more space to demonstrate without surveillance. As a whole, protesters took on more symbolic tactics, like dyeing fountains red or projecting images of Masa Amini onto the sides of buildings. These are actions that still showed support for the movement, but which didn't take up space in the same way and would be harder for authorities to directly tie to the individuals who were carrying them out. Looking at these details, we can see some significant differences in the ways that the protests evolved and in response to treatment by the state. First, in this analysis, I noticed that the Black Lives Matter protests largely used symbolism to draw attention to the system of policing in the United States, while the Women Life Freedom protests utilized symbolism to draw attention to the oppressive ideologies enforced by state leadership. However, in the use of space, the two protest movements were almost opposite in their approaches. Protests in the United States began with tactics of appearance, and they moved to more direct and disruptive approaches in response to interactions with state agents and the media. On the other hand, protests in Iran began with more direct and disruptive protests and were forced to move to a more dispersed use of space and symbolic actions after interactions with state agents in order to protect their own safety. These tactic changes were responses to the power of the regime in which they took place. The pluralist, federalist government of the United States afforded a level of legal protection that protesters needed to continue their efforts, and protesters also saw their message legitimized in some cases by some levels of government. The authoritarian government of Iran, however, showed no flexibility in their response, and protesters were forced to develop creative ways to criticize state actors while simultaneously protecting themselves from state actors. It's important to continue to note the effect that these protests have had and will have on the regimes in which they're operating, and to understand the lengths that civilians must go to within different regimes to pursue lasting change. Thank you.